afternoon to all of you, and particularly to our friends from the UK who've got up at the crack of dawn. I'm not even sure if it's dawn yet over there, but it's wonderful to have all of you joining us for what I'm sure will be a very, very interesting session. I promise not to talk for too much time, but just to very briefly, before I introduce the speaker, the subject of the talk, of course, is Enduring Duration, the Indian Soldier and Laborer, 1919 to 1921. So it's essentially, it focuses on this, this period of time that's actually very, very critical as far as India is concerned, both militarily and politically and socially, but which has, I think, been is kind of slipped through the cracks. And while you have a lot of focus that's been given as far as political history is concerned, but even from the military aspects and the other various angles that you can look at that time frame from, it's a largely unknown area. The dichotomy of this is, I think, expressed very well by the very fact that, when you look at the British War Medal that was awarded for service in World War I, the dates are 1914, 1918. The Allied Victory Medal that was awarded for the same conflict, the dates are 1914 to 1919. As far as the Indian Army was concerned, that the war never really finished. 1919 was or 1918 was a very, very European point of view. But for India, it rolled over into the Third Afghan War. And as all of us are very, very aware, the fact that if you look up at India Gate, which is a memorial to our war dead from the First World War, it also includes the Third Afghan War, because that was actually a continuation of a larger conflict. But then it wasn't just the Third Afghan War. What was happening in the Middle East, the massive Indian deployment in what became Iraq, and what was then known as the Arab Rebellion, and of course, subsequently on the Northwest Frontier. I mean, if you just look at the clasps that are awarded for the Indian Regional Service Medal 1908, you have Afghanistan, Northwest Frontier 1919, then you have Massoud 1919-21, Northwest Frontier 1921-24. So it just carries on. Radhika's work is very, very significant for a number of disciplines, a number of reasons. When she and her book that has just come out, which is titled "The Coolies' Great War," and which she will briefly, I think, introduce in her talk. That, of course, deals with the period 1914 to 1921, while the bulk of her talk is going to focus on the latter half of that period, 1919 to 21. And there was much that was happening in the Indian Army, there was much that was happening in the world, and I think, as Radhika will later argue, that India's participation, it wasn't just India's contribution to a global conflict, but actually India was very, very much, that conflict was very, very much an Indian conflict as well, for a variety of different reasons. Now, just a word about Professor Singha. She teaches at the Center for Historical Studies at the JNU, Delhi, and her research themes focus on social history of crime and criminal law, identification practices in relation to colonial governmentality, borders, and border crossing in South Asia. And the mobilization of human resources from India for World War I has become a second, often intersecting research track. And she's earlier published a book entitled The Despotism of Law, Crime and Justice in Early Colonial India, and articles on the identification practices, law, and infrastructural power, colonial travel documents, and non-combatant labor in World War I. So in many ways, Radhika is doing what Sherlock Holmes used to do earlier, when he started studying fingerprints and things like that. And to her eternal credit, actually, when she started off, and I remember when she started working, or when she was about to start working on her labor history project, or the Labor Corps, and I told her, I said, this is hopeless, you're not going to find anything. And she then went on to prove me absolutely wrong. She found some phenomenal records and, scattered in different archives around the world. And I would very strongly commend her book to anybody who's interested in the subject. So I will now zip up and over to you, Radhika.
Okay. So thank you all of you for being here for the talk today. When I started this project, I didn't think it was going to end up in a book. I started off by wanting to build up a conversation between military history and labor history, and with labor history, with a history of movement and migration across India's frontiers. As I had also realized that the non-combatants were very prominent, took up over, they were 500,000 out of India's 1.4, the 1.4 million that India contributed, but for their different reasons, both the Indian educated classes as well as the government of India wanted this, the figure of the coolie and the regimental menial to really blur into the picture of the valorous soldier. I also wanted, as all of us do, to correct Eurocentric approaches to World War I, to try to place India in the war, instead of seeing the war as an external event to which she contributed. And we can't understand what was happening in India between 1919 to 21 unless we see the connections which are building up through the war between already militarized zones in India along the frontier, the kind of networks of labor recruitment, the technologies, the work skills which were already developed there, how they were repurposed for World War I, but in the process, connections set up between already militarized zones and the new arenas of conflict. Men, material, and ideas flowed in these circuits and would come back to implode along the frontier between 1919 to 21, bringing the war right up to the frontiers of India. So in this particular talk today, I'm really going to talk about how we can work with different timelines, really, and how that kind of helps us to develop a transnational approach to World War I, which nevertheless takes account of its lumpiness, its unevenness, how the war began and ended, at a micro level for individuals, the war could begin and end at different points. But as Gerwart and others have pointed out, if you look at the war from, even Eastern Europe and right up till India, the war has a much more multi-layered ending than we would think if we just looked at the date 1914 to 1918. So now I go on to my PowerPoint. Okay, so my title, I put duration into my title because, the word gives us a sense really of the multi-layered durations of the war when we look at it at different levels. And it's in fact this multi-duration event which gives us, which allows us to understand it as a transnational event, but one with different intensities of experience. And here I draw upon current work on the ends of war, which remind us that the ending of the war is not an event, but rather a process. And that process really requires all kinds of interventions, because for everybody who wants a war to end, there are many who want the war to continue. The other question I want to take up is that somehow, almost in a default kind of way, we are told that demobilization contributed substantially to mass unrest in India in the period 1919 to 21. Now, the point is that one has to look at politics, the politics of the army in a more complex way, and not in the sense of a binary, either loyalty or disloyalty. So we have to look at politics in a much more complex way. And the reality for the army between 1919 to 21 was, from December 1919, partial demobilization, continued deployment for many. The demobilization was very staggered. And as soon as the Afghan war broke out in April and was followed by the much more intense Waziristan campaign, what you had was remobilization also. And as Rana had pointed out, the reality was that Britain was now at the height of her territorial power, but she required boots on the ground in Persia and Aden, as before, in the Middle East, where her footprint had expanded massively. And there were also internal security duties in India, which I think have not been really explored fully in the literature. So manpower continued to be needed for the field army at the frontier, in internal security and overseas. So what you had was, as Rana has already pointed out, what you had was in Iraq, you needed not only soldiers, but you continued to need Indian non-combatants for the railways and the Indian inland water transport. Also for the post office, you had a whole lot of Indian clerks manning the post office over there. And with the Arab uprising, you had 70,000 Indian soldiers who had to be rushed there in again. So in February 1921, you still had, at least in Mesopotamia, 74,000, 23,000 in Egypt and Palestine. Now, as I said at the beginning of my talk, to understand how war was coming closer to India, we have to start really with 1914. When the recruiting networks, the labor regimes, and work skills of the frontier military complex were repurposed for global war. Men, hardware, and ideas were moving in circuits between already militarized zones and new theaters of war. And this heightened ambitions and anxieties. So what you had was a series of implosions along the northwestern frontier, the Massoud campaign, the Murray Khetran uprising, and of course, Afghanistan's bid for independence. In May 1919, a bid for independence, which in fact was successful because Afghanistan got control of her foreign policy. And since it was successful, which is not acknowledged in many accounts, Britain then, the government of India then decided to tighten its hold over its side of the unadministered frontier. So what we had was a very hard-fought Waziristan campaign. So scenes along the frontier resemble those of northern France, really, in 1917. What you had was a war which deeply affected civilian populations, both on the northwestern frontier and the northeastern frontier. This is a picture of the demolition, and it wasn't covered to the same extent as the devastation which the Germans wreaked in northern France. So what you had was William Slim then doing his staff exams in Abbottabad, writing, "On every village green in England, monuments were rising which proclaimed the war was over. Yet here I had only to raise my eyes to see once more the piled sandbags, the rough stone parapet, and the writhing strands of barbed wire." And along the Assam-Burma border, what you had was another territorial conquest, namely the absorption of an unadministered area between the Assam, formally administered Assam border, and the formally administered Burma border. This again resulted in a war which really affected the civilian population, and yet without total embarrassment. In Shakespeare's account of the Assam Rifles, we have this picture of the burning of a major rebel village in 1980. Now, terminating the war. Because of, terminating the war wasn't just something which just happened. As I said, it required a whole lot of interventions to continue the war. And to contend with these, the possibility of a lot of unrest about the war not coming to an end with the armistice, the UK government, in fact, had to take power. It had to pass an act called Termination of the Act or War Act, where the government said that it decided when the war had come to an end. Now, among the reasons why it had to do so was in Iraq, for example, the laborers who had come on contracts which said 1 year or 2 years or till the end of the war said, well, you know, the armistice has been signed, we want to go home. Now, if Asiatic labor did not understand that the armistice was just a halt, it was not an end to the war, British soldiers in India were equally obtuse. Between May and July 1919, you had small strikes by British soldiers against moving into field service on the northwestern frontier. So the UK passed a War Definition Act, and the government of India took similar powers by the termination of the present War Definition Act. And this was cited to insist that British territorials were obliged to stay in India. And if we look even at the official date for termination of the war, the official date in the UK was 31st August 1921, and for India, it was 1st September 1921. Now, what did this extension of the war mean in terms of personal experience? I've taken just one regimental history, that is the 58th Rifles Frontier Force. Now, this unit sailed for France in September 1915, and it was a full 5.5 years later that it returned to Karachi. At every point when they thought they were going home, in fact, their leave was suspended. What were the intimate consequences of having to endure this extension? Marriages had been arranged and serious financial loss was anticipated. The influenza epidemic, which had ravished the country, had left many homes unprotected. No letters were received from India. This was perhaps as well, for they would have told of riots in the Punjab. Furlough had been sanctioned for 10%, but owing to the Afghan attacks, the Indian government was unable to send any reinforcements, so only a few very urgent cases could be allowed to leave the battalion. Now, did this mean then that the Indian soldier and the Indian NCO and the Indian VCO, they stayed loyal? Yes, to all intents and purposes, they continued to endure. But there was a lot which was changing in the loop between the home front and the war front. Extended deployment gave a new leverage to Indian military personnel. They could negotiate for an improvement in service benefits. Veteran constituencies began to emerge and to press themselves to the attention of the political leaders and political formations within India. They wrote them letters, sometimes anonymously, sometimes in the press even. Were service issues apolitical? It would be wrong to think that issues of disability pensions, gratuities, aftercare were apolitical. In a sense, what Indian soldiers and Indian officers were doing was that they were challenging the so-called natural gap between them and their British counterparts. Followers, that is, non-combatants, wanted parity in pay and pension benefits with combatants. Soldiers of the princely units wanted a parity with Indian Army soldiers. Now, this increased the cost of rallying to empire for Nepal and the princely states. And all this also forced a discussion about the rationalization of manpower use. Now, here we have a petition from Gurkha soldiers who found that the Indian soldiers were allowed to go home after the Waziristan campaign, but they were being detained in Dehradun. So here is this anonymous petition. The English who fought with us got enlisted for ₹50. We, your own subjects, are disposed of for ₹11. We had to come away leaving our land fallow. These British look upon us as mere, sorry, that's my, yes. The British look upon us as mere trifles and care for us no better than pubes. They say, Gurkha has come under our control. the subjects of our Gurkha government are exhausted, if the wish is to denude the country, to whose house are we to go to on our return? And after this very combative petition, the soldiers go back to a respectful conclusion. Let fair justice be done to us. We beseech you with folded hands on our feet. Now, what I also want to draw attention to is that return was something which was taking place not just between 1919 to 21. Return in permanent and temporary forms was taking place throughout the war. And to understand the timeline of the war and its politics, we have to understand that the non-combatants in particular insisted on a fixed exit point. A lot of them got it. Unlike soldiers and the permanent followers who had to serve for the duration of the war, many of the men in the labor corps, the inland water transport in Mesopotamia, the railways in Mesopotamia, wanted an exit point with this very formidable employer, that is the Indian Army in wartime. In addition, of course, there were combatants and non-combatants who were discharged from service, who were coming home on leave, who were returning to hospitals, and those who simply deserted. So here you have a memorial plaque at the Ballard Estate in Bombay, which gives you a sense that ports like Bombay and Karachi and Calcutta were not only exit points for the war, they were also turnstiles. People were coming and people were going. So here it says, in the port of Bombay in the Great War, 1,870,000 troops and personnel embarked and disembarked at the docks. So return was an integral part of the war experience. It was an experience which government had to manage and shape, and it was an experience which all Indian personnel also sought to shape, and they got more leverage for shaping it in the period between 1919 to 21. Government had to shape it to ensure the renewal of manpower supply, to foster loyal constituencies. The returning soldier was a theme in recruitment propaganda. The returning soldier was also a theme in a broader propaganda directed at diverse audiences, for example, schoolboys. He was cast as a vector of promising post-war transformation. He was described as returning in health, with savings, better informed about sanitation, ready to improve farming and colonize new tracts. Now, this return is actually, conceptualizing return is a very important part of recruitment propaganda. Now, here I've included a sketch from a British newspaper called the Daily Sketch, which is trying to show that cremation arrangements were made for the Indian soldier in Britain. And it says the Indian soldier goes home to his fathers. Now, this was not the kind of thing you wanted to show in recruitment propaganda. The Indian soldier did not want to go home to his fathers. He wanted to come home. And since many of them were young home, they actually wanted to come home and get married. So what you find is, in fact, that you have war propaganda, which is actually using actuarial statistics. You have Ladai Ka Akhbar, which is taking the statistics from the London Prudential of 1917 and saying that the London Prudential had shown that the odds of death for the British soldier were lower than for the infant in his cradle. And you have Mahatma Gandhi, who doing recruitment work at Nadiad in Gujarat, who is making the following calculations. He said if every village gave 20, then Khera would give 12,000, which would work out at 1.7%, a rate which Gandhiji said was lower than the death rate. Now, Gandhiji failed signally as a recruiter. Perhaps his statistics did not go down very well. Okay. And what is very odd, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I found that in India, the plague epidemic, which hit Punjab, a milder form in 1918, and of course the influenza epidemic of June 1918, which was followed by the even severer next blast of influenza in October 1918, was grist to the recruiter. They were telling people that, you know, you're more likely to die at home than you are likely to die in the healthful environment of a camp or a military camp. And in fact, that goes down in the census. And yet, if you look at the Sanitary Commissioner's report, it's simply not true. Because during the influenza epidemic, for every British soldier that died of pneumonia, nearly 10 Indian soldiers died from the same disease. But if, I tried to see whether this was ever a theme in other recruiting propaganda. It is there in Indian recruiting propaganda. Please let me know if it's there in other contexts as well. Okay, so what were the kind of desirable avatars for the returning soldier? Of course, the best avatar was the soldier who returned to recruit more. So here you have the sort of very famished-looking peasant or laborer who comes back looking healthy. He's fully clothed, and he's carrying the recruiter's rod. That is a rod taken by carried by recruiters for measuring the new recruit. So this is, of course, the idealized form of return. Then we have, of course, the figure of the Indian VCO who returns and commences a life as a gentleman. Now, this is actually not from the war. This is from 1910, a very idealized image of the Indian VCO as a Safed Posh, the person who can afford to wear white clothes because he is now distanced from labor. And of course, we find that ensuring that, the idea that VCOs had learned to live like gentlemen and therefore their post-war benefits should enable them to do so was a very prominent theme in these years, 1919 to 22. Now here, of course, we have the returnee in his undesirable avatars as the deserter, the person who was wounded, injured, or disabled, those who were court-martialed and jailed, and the prisoner of war who had traversed enemy territory. Now, all these undesirable figures could also be and were reshaped to serve the ends of war. So, for example, the Indian prisoners of war who had returned after a terrible time in Turkish prisoner of war camps, making railways in and coming back emaciated, etc. Their testimonies began to be recorded, testimonies of brutality to Indian prisoners of war in Ottoman Arabia and in East Africa were recorded to make the case that Ottoman Mesopotamia should not be restored to the Ottoman Empire and German East Africa should be absorbed into the British Empire. Here are released prisoners of war from the siege of Kut embarking for home from Constantinople. And of course, most importantly, those who came back had to be recycled for military use. What steps should be taken, asked the Provincial Recruiting Board in 1918, to induce wounded soldiers to assist in their own cure so that they may return to service instead of being invalided. Now, the invalided soldier was also grist to recruiting propaganda. For example, we find this picture of the Indian war loan. And what you see is, the Indian soldier, in fact, supporting the crippled British soldier and the Indian Imperial War Relief Fund, for both for the war loan as well as for the Indian Imperial War Relief Fund, which was in fact the largest ever charity set up in India. And what is interesting is that willy-nilly, in the process of distributing charity, the possibility of destitution had to be recognized both for the soldier as well as for the widow. Now, what you saw in that picture was that the Indian soldier is just walking with his arm bandaged. What you get in images from England is a few pictures of soldiers in wheelchairs, but I find that the wheelchair simply disappears. And in the few glimpses you catch of them thereafter, there are some disturbing pictures. Here you see them, with just a crutch, in sort of looking quite worn out and dispirited. This is during the Prince of Wales tour with the Maharaja of Patiala, and they're both inspecting ex-soldiers who have lost their limbs. Again, at Bombay, you have a rather disturbing picture where again you see native soldiers. The word which was used was maimed then. So this is the picture that you see. You can see that it is the rough crutches which they are using. They're not using any kind of prosthetic limb. Now, this also could be turned over and used for propaganda, because what was taken as a real triumph was that in some sense, beggary was seen as a part of, Oriental proclivities. That is, if you were maimed or blind, the natural tendency was to become a beggar. And so, teaching disabled soldiers trades such as motor mechanics and tailoring was cast as something specially significant, because mendicancy was seen as a natural element in India's peculiar composition. And here you have a picture of the Lady Billington, of the governor's wife in Bombay, who was very, very active, both in war loan activity as well as in the setting up of Queen Mary's Technical School of Disabled Indian Soldiers. Apparently, I read an article in Hindu which said that she liked everything in lavender, including the toilet paper, and that all the princely states were terrified of her landing up at their door, because anything she liked, she asked for. Her ADC apparently used to follow her around with a bag, and you said, ma'am, of course, if you like it, please take it. And apparently in Baroda, they hurriedly buried the state's jewels when she came to visit. But anyway, this very energetic governor's wife, she was one of the driving forces behind the setting up of Queen Mary's Technical School for Disabled Indian Soldiers. And I must say, I give credit to the Indian Army for retaining the name, because I think if we sort of remove names from institutions, we're stripping off layers of history. We can reassess that history, but we should hang on to that history. So here are images which show us the rehabilitation of disabled soldiers. You can see again that it is really the crutch which is figuring. The crutches here and here these are almost, the crutches almost figuring like props to the picture. We can see them here in front of these soldiers. The soldier who is disabled is literally propping himself up on the bonnet of a car. Now, these kind of images, actually soldiers went back to a lot of different kinds of work, but in particular, those items were highlighted in war propaganda, which seemed to herald post-war industrialization. That is tailoring with machines, tailoring with a sewing machine, hosiery for army clothing, motor mechanics, pump maintenance, which were all of immediate use to the war, and the gloss of technology also distanced these trades from occupations associated with so-called inferior castes. Now, what we find is we get a sense of what the soldier was thinking and doing from the kind of apprehensions which were expressed about how to induce disabled soldiers. And disabled was a very broad category. It was a broad category. It even included invalided people, because they wanted to show that the scheme succeeded. So they allowed people even with very limited disability to enter the school. So what was the soldier concerned about? What he was concerned about, and he was very right to be concerned about it, was would physiotherapy reduce the effects of bodily damage attributable to war or aggravated by war? Would trade training reduce the level of an injury pension? If he recovered too much, could he be asked to rejoin again for the wars now taking place on the northwestern frontier? So you have the Surgeon General Lucas advising Lady Billington that the scheme would have a greater prospect of success if the men are taken after they have secured their pensions. Otherwise, they will regard Your Excellency's philanthropic schemes as a dark and deadly scheme to deprive them of their pensions or to lessen the amount. Now, these were not unrealistic fears, because in negotiating the pensions, men were in a particularly ordinary soldier was not in a very powerful position vis-a-vis the medical boards who examined them. Issues like, that is, the examination of the effect of the war upon the body, the examination of the duration of those effects, the understanding about whether a particular disease which you might have had earlier had been aggravated by the war, or whether it was simply a normal progression of the disease. This was not in the hands of the soldier. This was in the hands of the medical board and the recommendation of his CO, etc. So he was quite right to be careful. Now, what we find is that the soldiers, when they were in England, they were visited by the British monarch and the Secretary of State. And at Brighton Hospital, they had promised the soldiers that they would receive the same kind of artificial limb as British personnel. And they remember that they circulated that and they insisted on receiving the more expensive, what they call rubber limbs. I've been trying to work out what exactly these rubber limbs were. I'll show a picture and you can tell me whether I was right or wrong. But these limbs were considered too sophisticated for their way of life. For example, a former Gurkha CEO said that the springs break. And when the men return into Nepal, there is no means for having them repaired there. But those who were disabled, and there was an effort to discourage them initially from getting these limbs because they cost more. They cost 300. But they insisted on getting them even if they would actually use only the sturdier wooden pin legs. Now, here's a rather disturbing picture. I think this is the Anglesey leg, and I think the soldiers referred to it as rubber because the foot is made out of rubber. And this is a picture of the more simple pin and bucket wooden leg, which would probably be much easier to use and would be more durable. Of course, we had all the craft traditions in India to make good wooden legs, but that's another story. So what you have is Claude Hill, who was in the Viceroy's Council, who said that to avoid jealousy, it became necessary to give the limbs to all who asked for them. In the majority of cases, the proud possessors used them only as exhibition toys. But what it was important for soldiers to do was to be able to evidence the fact of their war service, that they had got their injury through the war and not in any other way. So what you have is that time is being experienced during the war in different kind of ways. There are people who are on limited contract. There are people who are on duration of war. Throughout the war, you have a debate about whether it was better to pay people by the month or to contract labor by the month, or whether to make them pay them by task work. You had constantly soldiers being told that in wartime, you have to do things which you cannot do in normal time. In wartime, you have to eat with your shoes on. In wartime, you have to accept platoon messes. And they responded to that. When they sort of spoke back also, they had a sense themselves also that war service demanded a different notion of time. Telling time also, that is what you find is that soldiers are using the calendar in their letters. They're buying watches when they can in France because it's cheaper and more affordable. So what you have is that they see the ability to tell time in these different ways as a way of emplacing themselves in modernity. You also have in soldiers' letters and in non-combatants' letters a sense also of the time of sukh in war and the time of dukh. For example, you have soldiers who later on in the war in France, where the infantry is, getting bashed up a bit less, they're writing and telling people at home that when it was dukh, you were here. Now we are in more sukh and you're no longer here with us, because conditions were, of course, better by 1917, 18 than they were earlier. Now, in terms of financial commitment, the state wanted to cast the war as a finite event, an event which had a concluding point. Medical care and charitable assistance were expected to efface or reduce its effects. So Indian military personnel had to direct the story of the greatest war in history from the realm of official commemoration into the realm of their bodies, as well as their family circumstances. They also had to challenge the idea of a full medical knowability of its effects. And they were very right to challenge it because, of course, disability pensions had to take account of new circumstances. They had to take account of shell shock. They had to take account of influenza. They had to take account of the loss of earning ability due to deafness, due to heavy artillery. And Indian soldiers and non-combatants also refused to allow simply the passage of time to absolve the debt. So time was very important to their politics. Time was very important to the leverage which they were seeking in the period between 1919 to 22. Now, what they did was that to contend with the sense of a unilateral decision about the effect of the war upon themselves, their bodies, and their families, many of them started going to taking legal help to present their cases. Now, this was not approved of by the army. The army only wanted them to go to district soldier boards, and if a petition had the look of a lawyer, shaping it, the CEO would disapprove, but they went on doing it. And what you find is a very nice pamphlet, which actually, puts down some of the soldiers' grievances, and you can hear the soldier's voice coming through. The pamphlet says, how far is the state justified in taking men of a foreign nation to a fierce and scientific war, like the Great European War, and getting them disabled? And when they ask for some pension, the state, to escape its liabilities, puts the simple plea of time limited. Why, asked the pamphlet, were there still thousands of unresolved pension cases? The answer it gave was, because the debtors' agents cannot look into people's grievances with the creditor's eye. I'll conclude by pointing out that the long end of the war had very important political consequences for India. Now, the point is that in most of the literature, the estimation of the effect of the war usually starts in 1918. That is, they all start by saying that, India expected a lot from the war, but instead it got the Rowlatt Act, etc. But what we have to understand is the kind of interventions which had to be made to actually bring the war to a close. Because from the British point of view, Punjab had to be preserved as a recruiting ground. Now, in Punjab, people had put up with, the Defense of India Act for 5 years. And the Rowlatt Act seemed to say that, all the patwaris and the policemen and everybody can continue to use the same powers which they had used for the previous 5 years. Military expenditure soared. You had 4 post-war deficit budgets. Now, this compromised industrial and economic reconstruction and budgeting for education and health. In the Middle East and West Asia, what you had was French and British imperialism, which now replaced German militarism. So the question began to be asked, what were the purposes for which the Indian army could be used? So what you had was, from the point of view of Indian soldiers, what you had was that the we of empire changed. Soldiers now demanded benefits with a sense of entitlement, not as an act of grace and favor. Discharged soldiers began to take legal assistance to claim pensionary benefits. They allowed community leaders to leverage their war service, but they wanted this influence to be used for their own demands and issues as well. So, in a sense, then, what you have is a situation in which, from the militant end of the political spectrum, questions also began to be asked about what were the purposes of using the Indian army and who decided. And in a sense, soldiers and non-combatants, by leveraging these years, 19 to 21, were also changing the terms of their use. That's it.